contemplative practice that I am most grounded in is mindfulness, and then extended by what we've come to call appreciative practice, but it's a sort of intentional extension based on the current work that we're doing. So I'm a parent and I'm a physician, and I think in both my parenting and in my clinical practice, mindfulness has been extraordinarily helpful. I'm also a teacher, and most recently have gotten involved in what we've called appreciative practice, which is so the intentional kind of focusing on the best in who we are and bringing that out. And so mindfulness has been incredibly helpful in helping me to be aware of how, self-aware, and aware of how I can do that in an intentional way. So I would say mindfulness has been an extraordinary help to me. Yes, so let me just talk about doctoring for a minute, because obviously I am a doctor and so I practice doctoring, but I also teach it. And both in that ability to be present with a patient, and in the developing a capacity to make good decisions, both of those are enhanced by a practice like mindfulness. To make a good clinical decision, one has to be aware of all the biases that one brings to a situation. One has to be aware when the patient is mentioning something that I end up putting aside or ignoring. I have to be aware that I'm putting that aside, so that when the clinical course changes and I need to bring that information back in, I'm able to do it. Obviously, to be truly present, I have to be practiced at that, so that pretty much no matter what else is going on, I can be present with a patient, and be aware continuously. If I'm distracted, put that aside and be present. So I think in both of those situations, it's been really helpful. Absolutely. In being aware of, that capacity to kind of be aware of things as they're going on, and being able to step out of the emotions of the moment, or I guess perhaps you would say step deeper into them, and not have them run me into a certain kind of being, but rather being able to step above it and say, is this the choice I really want to make? Is this the thing I really want to say? Has been hugely helpful. And I would say that both my kids learned from it as well. So yes, being a mindful parent has been wonderful. I think we see mindfulness being integrated at a fairly rapid pace into teaching medical students and nursing students and all kinds of students, as well as practicing health professionals, and being applied in the healthcare setting in many different ways. It's almost happened before we knew it was happening, if you know what I mean. And now that we're aware, I'm beginning to see the way it has already infiltrated. I think naming that and bringing people together in a thoughtful way to say, how can we do that, perhaps in a more mindful way, I think will help us a lot. And that's part of what's going to be wonderful about what comes out of this conference. There was an interesting comment, and now I don't remember who made the comment, but I heard it kind of reiterated in the education forum that was going on just now, that the separation of work and life the separation of teaching from being, the separation of, doctoring from being, is becoming kind of not so appropriate anymore. So teaching and doctoring and those kinds of things are really becoming more about being. So as a good teacher, I am an integrated whole. I'm not just a teacher in the classroom and then I go off and I do something completely different. So I think integrating our life fully, so integrating our work into our, whatever you would call our non-work, I guess, I think is becoming a theme across this conference. And so if you take integration, I guess, to the next level, it's integrating our academic communities and our work communities to the rest of our community, integrating, whether it's Virginia Tech or UVA, into the community in which it lives. That all starts to become one whole as opposed to separate entities. So yes, I think it will integrate into our community, and I think that the contemplative community as a whole across the country or across the world is already starting to integrate, no matter what discipline you're from. Social media is really helpful with that kind of integration. Absolutely. And I think, like was said earlier in the discussion today, that I think the younger generation is learning some of this not, from going to a class or from a book, or they're learning it simply by kind of growing up with it, which is not something that my generation experienced. Many of us had to kind of go and learn it. This is something that our kids now are growing up with and is kind of a part of them without them even realizing, if you will, that it's a separate practice, which is, I think, kind of nice. Oh yes, I think it already has in a way. I think it already has. We just haven't named it quite yet. But in a sense, I think that it's this kind of conference is a way of naming it and bringing it forward consciously. But I think on an unconscious level, yes, it's gone viral. Which is very exciting. I don't think so. I actually tend to think of this as an evolutionary process. I feel like, I hope that as an organism, I guess, although it's bigger than an organism, it's bigger than just humans, that we're evolving, and that this process is part of that evolution. So the different conversation we're having, that it is because we've evolved. It's not by chance. And that gives me great hope, because the problems that we're faced with right now that seem unsolvable to me in my generation, it's clear to me these problems are not unsolvable to the generation coming up that is thinking differently and interacting differently. And that is very exciting. That's a really good question. I don't think it's a skill. I think, though, I guess the analogy that I would think most fits is, or the comparison might be running. Because I think mindfulness practice is mind training in a way that running is body training. Of course, they're not separate. But they are both practices that get better with practice, that become a part of your, if running becomes a part of your muscle memory, which it really does, then mindfulness becomes a part of your mind memory, or it's a capacity you develop, and once you've developed that capacity, no one can take it away from you. It's part of you, and so it's not a skill. It's something that integrates in a way and becomes a part of you. It certainly gets better with practice. I'm not sure whether you lose it. I think you lose it a little bit without practice, like you lose running. But honestly, anybody who's been a runner or a piano player or knows that when you sit down to the piano again, you're not starting over. You're in a place because of muscle memory and that is different. And I think that's more like what mindfulness is. I'm a part of the Center for Appreciative Practice, which is the group that was brought in to help facilitate the conference using a process called appreciative inquiry. And so that's part of why I'm here, is to facilitate. But we're at the center really honored to have been asked to do that, because the topic of the conference is something that we are deeply rooted in. In the Center for Appreciative Practice, this is a lot of what we do and promote. We help others use appreciative inquiry for many different reasons, but wow, this is a topic that we feel really happy to be able to facilitate. Certainly at UVA, we are absolutely thrilled to be able to work with tech. That there's a wonderful piece of that for us personally, to be able to move this forward. Because at UVA, of course, we're engaged in a lot of things around mindfulness and contemplative science. And so to be here with other people in academics who are interested in integrating these is just very exciting. And it's very exciting to be able to use appreciative inquiry as the process by which we, go forward through this conference, because appreciative inquiry is like just made to do this kind of thing, where you want to bring everyone's wisdom into the room and use that collective experience to create a new future. And so to be able to do that around this topic is just fabulous, and with these people. I think that there are going to be many different ways that this idea and these practices end up growing. I'm quite certain that the more other people can experience this, the more they will begin to understand it. And I think the key that the conundrum maybe that we've been talking a lot about is how do you make that happen? How do you give other human beings the experience of this? And I'm not sure how that's going to play out, but I'm sure that is one of the things that everyone's energy and wisdom is going to be focused around. Someone said talking about it, evangelizing, and it's an interesting concept, because I think up until now, most of us who do a contemplative practice have considered it more or less a kind of individual practice, and so now that we're talking about doing it in a community and integrating into the other things that we do, as opposed to holding it as a separate practice. So over here I am contemplative, and then the rest of the time I work, or whatever. Now we're talking about integrating all of this. It's fascinating because in that integration process, people will begin experiencing this in all kinds of ways. And it may not be called mindfulness. By the way, you just did mindfulness. Did you know that? It may just be a way that people start to connect, or that people start to be more self-aware. And they didn't actually know it had a name, or, so it'll grow, I think, when people get perhaps smaller experiences in their domain that they didn't even realize were related. So yes, I do believe that contemplative practice does have direct effects on our bodies, our health, our well-being. In fact, we just finished a study on chronic pain and how people who did well with this difficult experience of living through chronic pain, what is it that helped them? And one of the things that they told us consistently was that reflective practices, contemplative practices were helpful to them. We heard in one of the keynotes how the experience of pain is different from the experience of suffering. And we had pain patients in this study tell us that exact thing, that they learned through a contemplative practice to say, yes, this is hurting right now, but I don't need to let that hurting drive my life. And so they learned to through the choices they made, to separate those. And then they learned, that meant that they were able to learn to live well despite some physical situations that they couldn't necessarily change or control. So absolutely, I think this affects, I guess I should say, our experience of well-being. Whether it will cure cancer or is in some ways a separate question. But I think in terms of us being able to, as human beings, really flourish, absolutely, it has a huge impact, I think. We're just beginning to figure that out. All the cardiovascular and neurologic connections, for example, we're just beginning to explore. Can we prevent heart disease by training the mind? Very possible. We just don't know yet. So there's going to be, I think, in the next 20 years, an explosion of research on these lines.